Hello, I am Klaus Dittrich. I am originally from Germany. I studied at universities in Germany, in Poland, in France and in Britain. And after graduation, I worked in South Korea and Luxembourg. I arrived to Hong Kong in 2015 and I am now an assistant professor at the Department of Literature and Cultural Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong. I am a historian and I specialize in the history of education. History of education as an academic discipline investigates how education developed over time. Let me give you one example. Today we take it for granted that all children all over the world go to school to receive a primary or even secondary education. And often it is even compulsory. But this was not always the case. So how did we arrive to this situation? When did it start? Why did this start? From where did this start? Let me give you a second, more recent example. Maybe you are aware of all these international large-scale assessments of education, such as PISA of the OECD. Maybe you are also aware of all these different university rankings. Today, it seems that education trains competencies. Education is output-oriented. Education is evidence-based. Governments put a huge emphasis on STEM education. How did all this come into being? So, history of education does not just study the past, but history of education serves to better understand education in the world that we are living in today. The history of education is a very diverse field with so many fascinating aspects. Yeah? Of course, it is already interesting to study educational institutions, educational policies, but there is so much else. For example, I have many colleagues who work with photographs as historical sources. It is so interesting to look at old images, images of schools, of classrooms, teachers and students, and to learn something about education in the past from these visual sources. Other colleagues work on pandemics in the history of education. So for example, tuberculosis or influenza were affecting education in the early 20th century. Also, gender and education is a fascinating topic, and there is so much else that you can discover. So you can develop on a lot of different topics in the history of education in your coursework essays. So there are so many, so diverse approaches to the history of education. Global history is currently one of the most innovative fields in history. Traditionally, historians have analyzed the history of one country, be it China, Japan, France, Germany. The nation and nationalism remains important. But it is also important to have a more comprehensive global perspective on history. For example, to see one country not isolated, but as part of a larger global world. Historians of education have adopted this global perspective. So in the program, we will, for example, ask, how did educational ideas travel from one country to another? Which role did imperialism play in education? Or how did international organizations shape education? There are very few programs that specialize in the history of education. At the Education University of Hong Kong, we are very happy to have this unique program. The MAGI program is interdisciplinary. This means that we combine history of education, and more contemporary international and comparative education. The MAGI program has a global dimension with a particular focus on Asia. In history of education, in sociology of education, there are currently a lot of debates on the so-called East Asian model of education. And I think Hong Kong is the ideal location to learn about this East Asian model of education, because in the greater Bay Area you have Hong Kong, you have Macau, you have Guangdong with its different education systems. And in just 3 hours of air travel, you can arrive to Korea, to Japan, to Singapore, to Vietnam, where you can see even more different Asian education systems. In addition, the Education University of Hong Kong has a very beautiful campus that is located in the Tai Po area. So this is a very green environment, a very natural environment. Still, you just take the shuttle bus and within 1 hour you are in Kowloon or on Hong Kong Island in the center of the city. So it's really a good opportunity to study at the Education University of Hong Kong. I am teaching 2 courses in the MAGI program. So if you come to study with us, you will definitely meet me in at least one of your courses. The first one is called Educationalizing the World from the 18th to the 21st century. This is essentially an introduction to modern global history of education. We will study together how formal education, schools have expanded throughout the world during the last centuries. We will also see how education has been increasingly seen as a means to address a lot of different social, political, economic issues. The second course I am teaching is called A History of International Schooling in East Asia. In this course, we study together how schools for foreigners were established in China, in Korea, in Japan during the imperial age in the 19th and early 20th century. And we will also see how international schooling has significantly expanded in the more recent period, yeah, and now mostly catering for local populations.